Therapists. What are some red flags we should look for in therapists? Therapist here, and I'm really sorry knowing that some of you have had negative experiences with counseling. Not everyone is going to click and be able to build that rapport, but it's also the therapist's job to recognize when the rapport is not there or when we're completely out of the scope of what we are working with. It's important to realize what you specialize in, make that decision to refer to someone else more qualified in that area. It's hard to know sometimes when to refer because you want to give time for rapport building, but you also don't want to waste your client's time, and when you eventually refer, it's frustrating for them to have to start all over again with a new person. An important thing I've learned is that sessions don't always have to be talk therapy. Hopefully, you can kind of tell when someone's just not into it that day. Talking and psychoeducation are important, but sometimes I'll just play cards or do something not overtly therapeutic. Sometimes people feel more able to open up if you don't push them and let them do it on their own time. I'm not trying to waste anyone's time by playing games or doing other things, but sometimes it's therapeutic to just be present with someone. I had one adult male client who was struggling, and one day I suggested just coloring, sort of half joking, and he said, "That sounds goofy as hell. I'd love to. I haven't colored since I was little." We talked about just random things, and I learned a lot more about him through the mindless activity. Another thing that is important is to not completely panic when you have someone experiencing thoughts of self-harm. You want to give them that safe space to talk about it. You can't panic and start looking for hospitals as soon as you hear the S word. Many people just want to be heard and want to reach out for help. It's important to talk it through because I've found many times they don't want to hurt themselves. It's a general idea of, I don't want to be here anymore. There's no intent or plan or means, but you wouldn't know that if you freak out as soon as they say it. Sometimes people use the word self-harm and don't completely understand what that means. Sometimes it just means frustrated or overwhelmed and they don't know how to express it. You have to be cautious definitely, and it's always good to staff with colleagues and come up with a safety plan and protective factors. People aren't going to feel comfortable talking to you if you jump too quickly. They may feel like they're being punished, and it makes you worry that they won't be honest about it in the future because they're afraid of the consequences. That's when you have to be concerned when you start scaring them off. Story 2. I've heard a lot on how to be a better listener and help friends. I'm a crisis counselor in training for a crisis line, so this is just my 2 cents based on the training I'm getting. Number 1, be empathetic. Highlight their strengths. If someone says, "I can't stop hurting myself," or something along those lines, thank them for sharing. Tell them they're brave for reaching out to find help. Tell them they're inspiring and that they're trying to better themselves. Number 2, try not to give advice. On one hand, I'm training for the Crisis Text Center. Their rule is to never give advice unless you're referring them to resources, if the texter specifically requests them. Even though you may have lots of experience in whatever the other person is going through, once you try to solve their problems for them, or tell them go talk to their parents or friends to solve it, you start to make the situation so that the texter is now reliant on others to solve their issues for them. Problem solving for people in crisis should be collaborative. When someone asks, "I'm so stressed right now, what should I do?" Telling them what to do makes them now dependent on you to solve their issues. Instead, asking, "Has this ever happened to you before?" or "What do you usually do to help calm yourself down?" makes it so that the texter reflects on their own strengths and finds how to deal with their issues and not be dependent on others. On the other hand, sometimes you have to give advice. The other text line I'm training for, people usually come for advice on what to do or some legal advice in their situations. When the question becomes, "I want to run away. How do I keep myself safe?" and not, "How do I deal with my stress?" sometimes it's necessary to tell them about what options they should consider. Number 3, validate. Selectively. When they say, "Everything sucks, I just want to disappear," saying something like, "What I'm hearing is that you're feeling overwhelmed by your situation. It's perfectly normal to want to get away from your problems." It helps them more directly face their problems and feel better about it. But if they said, "I can't stop hurting myself," or say something about self-harm or something that threatens the safety of themselves or others, validating that isn't really the best thing to do. When it comes to those messages, explore why they do what they do and find alternative things they can do that can replace it. Number 4, keep the conversation about them, not you. This is kind of common sense. Saying, "I understand" or "I'm sorry you're going through that" puts the focus of attention on your feelings, not theirs. Keep the spotlight on what they're going through and how they're feeling about it. This is different from my examples from the first tip. When you're being empathetic, you're describing their strengths and putting the spotlight on them. When you say, "I could never start to imagine what you're going through," now the focus is on you. See what I mean? Number 5, reiterate, summarize. Go over what they're saying in your own words. Not only does this confirm that you're on the same page with the other person, it also shows the other person that you're truly listening, trying to help, and that they have 100% of your attention. Do this sparingly, though. You don't want to sound like a parrot. Number 6, go through things one at a time and take your time. When you're trying to solve the other person's problems together, ask a question one at a time. Don't overwhelm them with questions, especially if y'all are exploring touchy subjects. And when you're asking questions one at a time, space them out. It shouldn't feel like an interrogation. It's okay to just validate their feelings, highlight their strengths. You don't have to ask questions with every sentence. Let them speak. Number 7. Sometimes it's better to be direct. This is a touchy topic for a lot of people, but one thing that caught my eye with my crisis text line training is that we should be direct with feelings of self-harm. Don't mince words. Asking if someone is threatening to harm themselves will not plant the idea in their heads. Sometimes people just keep their feelings away and desperately look for someone to talk about. But again, it's a touchy subject that almost never comes up. Most personal talks with friends never go that far. It's kind of different when you're face-to-face with the other person, but it never hurts to ask. This really put a lot of things into perspective, even for me. Story 3. Not a therapist, but if they break confidentiality. When I was 14 to 16, I was seeing a therapist back in my hometown, very small town, only 2 available therapists. Due to CPS-related stuff and a cruel parent, everything discussed during sessions was strictly between us. And I was informed about that already before my first session. She seemed very nice, but I found out she was passing information along to my mom, the wrongdoer, which gave her leverage. Everything I told her was passed on to my mom. All she had to do was call the therapist and ask. This made me extremely anxious, and I stopped going to her altogether. When I moved to another city 2 hours away from my hometown, I started seeing a new therapist who actually was good, and I slowly started to regain my trust back. During school, I got a call from her asking me if mom's name was my mother, which I confirmed. She then informed me that my mom had called their office, asked who my therapist was, got her number, called her, and then asked her to break confidentiality. Asked what we talked about during our sessions and just straight up demanded answers. My therapist told her no, that information was strictly between us. She was not allowed to share any details unless I had told her otherwise, that my mom was not entitled to any info I had shared and it was none of her business. My mom proceeded to lose her stuff over the phone and eventually got hung up on. She simply called me to inform me about this instead of exposing everything to her behind my back. And that's when I realized I actually could trust her. I unfortunately got kicked out of school and had to move back, but I got to keep my amazing therapist. I had an appointment every other week so I could plan my bus trips accordingly. My mom offered to drive me back and forth the first few weeks until she decided to use that against me and pulled the, if you won't tell me what you talk about during your sessions, then I won't be driving you there again. Because as you say, it's none of my business. I think she was so used to getting her way and my former therapist was snitching that she couldn't handle it when I got a new one and stuff changed. She needed the control, I guess. The first therapist I had almost scared me away from seeking help because I was so scared that my privacy would be breached. My mom would come to know every single private and intimate secret I had and use those against me. I'm so glad I actually found one who took their job and me seriously so soon after the betrayal. I've since bounced a little from shrink to shrink, but every single one of them has been amazing compared to my first one. Story 4. I think there's a misconception that advice giving is what is most helpful. Therapists don't often give advice, but rather they offer alternative perspectives and create space for a collaborative approach to explore new ways of overcoming obstacles. We, as therapists, shouldn't ever assume we know what is best for a client to do. It is their life. If you have a therapist telling you what to do, I would have to assume there is an unhealthy power dynamic occurring which can have a variety of negative outcomes. Of course, there is a time and place for advice, but usually that should come from a peer or family who are essentially at the same power level as you. It should be noted that suggestions, recommendations, etc. are totally fair game for a therapist to provide. The difference between this and giving advice is that giving advice assumes you know what is best and you're telling them to do something specifically. I'll often suggest to my clients, for example, have you ever thought about journaling to get some of your emotions out instead of keeping them in? I'd argue this isn't advice. It's up to them to decide whether they want to do it, and I'm not promising any specific outcome. If they seem to like the suggestion, I may assign homework for them to journal. This is more concrete, like some of you have mentioned, but I don't think it is advice. Maybe it's semantics. Also, every therapist has their own style and personality. It's not always going to be a good fit between client and therapist. Shopping around for a therapist should be encouraged if possible. Find what works best for you. Going to therapy is hard work. It should be. Changing yourself is hard work. This is why some people avoid it. It's not easy, but usually worth it. Liking the video so far? Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. Story 5. Therapist in training here. I think everyone has covered most of the big ones. Here's a bullet point list of what I think others covered. If they don't provide informed consent, if they don't review the rules of confidentiality every so often, if they strictly provide advice rather than encourage you to think of options, if they don't gently challenge your thoughts and assumptions, if they try to push your religious agenda, checking their phone and email while with you. Here's what I would add. If they ever at any point make a pass or flirt with you, if they try to friend you on Facebook or any other social media, if they disclose identifying details about other clients to you, if they shame you for any decision or otherwise deliberately make you feel bad, if in groups, couples, family, etc. counseling, they seem to pick one side over the other, choose a team, if they disclose traumas that happened to them during the session and somehow make the conversation about themselves rather than about you. Hope this helps. Story 6. If they are distracted at all, check a text or email or anything during the session. If they can get you in immediately, it may mean they don't have many clients. This could either mean they're very new or not a very good therapist. Could also mean they had a cancellation. So do some research. Any kind of flirtation, it does happen, get out of there. Not helping you define goals to move forward. Some therapists are happy to take your money and just let you complain about life for an hour. And while that might be a relief for you, it's only going to help long-term if there are actionable steps taken that are agreed upon by you and your therapist. This is the work of therapy and most important, but also when many people drop out. Also, I see life coaches popping up on therapy resource pages. They're not trained professionals. Avoid. A couple good points have been made. Definitely being able to get you in right away doesn't always mean something negative. I probably should have left that out altogether. Certain therapists, usually dialectical behavioral therapists, do need to be available 24/7, so certainly they might check phone or email, but they should also be upfront with you about that aspect of their practice before you begin. And I'm sure life coaches can be helpful in some areas. The main issue is many are attempting to masquerade as therapists. The amount of hours of their training, 100 is what I read, does not compare to the schooling and the postgraduate hours, 2,000, others need to obtain for licensure to treat mental illness. Not to mention that you actually do need to take steps that's not in your own pace. Story 7. Therapist here. My role is a little different as I'm a trauma-based or short-term crisis therapist, meaning I just help stabilize my clients to where they can be transferred to a lower level of care. To me, warning flags are no risk assessment, no crisis planning, no exploring triggers, no plan to help you cope when faced with a trigger, especially important when triggered in or out of session, no timeline for treatment, no discussion about your rights as a patient, too much advice giving. I call this could've, should've, would've people. Also giving advice about anything outside of their scope of practice, medical treatment, religious practices, legal issues, etc. In family or couple sessions especially, any therapist who acts like a referee to determine who is right or wrong. Covering these items are important in therapy because it will help the patient long-term in processing emotions, using healthy coping skills and problem-solving on their own. I can't speak to those clinicians in private practice because I'm in community mental health, but for agency-based therapy, it is not a long-term service. Most CMH agencies are bound by EBP, evidence-based practices, which are time-limited and short-term, 6 to 12 weeks. I would be wary of a therapist who seems like they're dragging out your treatment. The goal is progress, not perfection. Story 8. My old therapist would leave the ringer on her cell phone and would check it during sessions. She would also sometimes talk about how hard it was to come to work some days. She laughed a lot. She would laugh at certain things I struggled with, like something specific triggering me, and would brush off those problems with things like, it'll change when you get older, or fake it till you make it. I suffer from emotional dysregulations and I'm highly impulsive, so when I get mad, I do a lot of messed up stuff. When I would share stories about mean things I did while angry and impulsive, she would laugh and say things like, I can't believe you did that, and that's crazy. Eventually, she started shortening our sessions from an hour to 45 minutes and sometimes even to 30 minutes. Worst thing was that I requested to see her once every 2 weeks, but she always scheduled me in for once a month. Later on, I found out that was highly unethical due to my self-harm and tendencies, and she should have actually been seeing me once a week instead. God, I hope that license gets revoked. Story 9. LCSW checking in here. I've been a provider and consumer, and here's what I got as red flags. It doesn't feel good when you reach out for services. About a year ago, I was in the middle of the worst depressive episode, in a very vulnerable place. It's true that asking for help takes all the strength to muster up when you're feeling super crappy, but damn did I go through half my insurance's provider list with several cutting me off and telling me they're not taking new clients, texting me back after I called them to tell me the same, or the feeling that I'm being a bother, i.e. crappy bedside manner. No documents at the start of therapy. You should be getting paperwork that says how they bill you, how they will protect or under what circumstances they will break, confidentiality, and talk about risks and benefits for services. There should be a discussion about what therapy looks like. Talks at you, over you, or doesn't listen to your needs. I've been trained that the client is the one that self-determines the course of treatment. If your therapist doesn't make you feel empowered, it's probably not a good fit. If bringing up desired changes in therapy results in no change or defensiveness, that's on the therapist. not strengths-based. Solely dwelling on your screw-ups instead of looking for the good things about you that can help you overcome your problems is a bad sign. Using your strengths to help you overcome them is a good thing. Doesn't take safety concerns seriously or overreacts to safety concerns. Mentioning that you're having thoughts about hurting yourself should be taken seriously, with lots of questions to make sure that you're going to be safe, and with some resources given to you if you fall apart after the session. On the other hand, saying that you're having thoughts and the immediate response of the therapist is to put you, involuntarily, in the hospital is also no bueno. Oversharing. There's a difference between self-disclosure that helps to normalize what you're going through, and the therapist either talking about their life to the point where the boundaries are not therapist-client, but like your buddies, or the therapist making the session about them and not you, creeping you the heck out. I'm a guy. I had a woman therapist want to tell me about medication she was taking so that she could be intimate with her boyfriend. What the heck? As a male giving therapy to women when it comes to intimacy, I always explain why I'm asking. Give my client the option not to answer, let them know it's okay to not answer, and ask the relevant question or questions as clinically as possible. Facebook or Instagram friend request or suggest friend in those platforms. This means they can't teach, have appropriate boundaries, or respect your privacy. This is either an indication of crappy boundaries, a gross breach of your confidentiality, i.e. they gave permission to Facebook to upload their address book with your information, or both. That's what I got off the top of my head. Story 10. I've had a few really good therapists and a few really weird or off ones. Two in particular stand out. One asked me where to put myself in the Enneagram, and when I explained that I've adapted throughout my life and can kind of rotate throughout them, she told me that's not possible. When I did the tests and it defined me equally with some, she said I must have lied and continued the therapy but locked me into one type, and if my response wasn't typical of that one personality, then I wasn't being true to myself. Not against Enneagrams, but she treated it like a horoscope. It literally wasn't a person to her, just a type. The second one told me I needed more salt lamps at home and that the plants in his office were strategically placed to absorb my negative energy. No, dude, I don't need salt lamps. I just agreed to terminate life support on my brother. I needed to grieve. Oh, and there was the one constantly spending the whole session talking about Trump. Why even become therapists? Well, if you like these stories, here's more. YouTube thinks you're going to love this. Catch you in that video.